Should I click OK?
Okay.
Yes, and we are live, I believe. So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for this seminar. My name is Anna, and I am the nutrition consultant at Choices Markets at our Kelowna location. My team and I offer complimentary nutrition education across our stores in BC, which you can book through our website. I'd also like to mention that if you are in this seminar, that you are eligible for a nutrition buck, which is a $10 off coupon when you spend $50 or more. You'll be sent a survey link where you can select which store you'd like to pick up this coupon from, and you'll have 30 days to do so, and you can collect them at our customer service desk. And I will introduce our guest speaker, Thalia. She has a lifelong passion for all things nutrition and healthy living, with over 30 years in the health industry. Her former training, as well as personal and professional experience, form a strong basis for her speaking and education. Her experience includes an eclectic background in herbal medicine, nutrition, essential oils, green living, meditation, vegetarian cooking, and working as a wellness coach, fitness instructor, and personal trainer. Thalia is also the author of The Confident Food Shopper, The Guide to Food Labels and Fables, The Expert Patient, Health is Not a Spectator Sport, and the 3-Minute Liquid Meal Blueprint. I'd also like to mention that if you have any questions throughout our presentation, you can enter them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end. I will pass it on to Thalia.
Thank you very much. And thank you for Choices co-sponsoring this training tonight or webinar. And just a quick mention of this is also co-sponsored by Now Health Group. And Now is a family-owned company, 56 years old, a little bit older than me. That says a lot. If you want to know more about them, you can go onto their website and download this very interesting book, Beating the Odds. But we're here tonight to talk about vitamin D, which is a very topical and actually very interesting. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot, so let me jump into it. But first, just a quick disclaimer, as always, of course, talks are for informational purposes only. So, the bottom line is everything I say is descriptive, not prescriptive. It isn't medical advice. Any information I give or written here, materials linked, or questions answered at the end is always at the user's own risk. So always run things by your own doctor or somebody whose care that you are under if you're not sure. And for any products, in this case, it's vitamin D tonight, so it's quite simple, but you can look at nowfoods.ca for suggested uses, doses, and cautions on the product. So let's start with the basics. What is vitamin D? Why this guy? Well, vitamin D does a lot. That's why juggling a lot of things in the air. But vitamin D is very interesting because firstly, it's a vitamin, as in the name, and a vitamin simply means something that we cannot make in our own bodies, at least not enough of, to live. We need it. So typically it means we have to get it from our diet. Although what's very unique about vitamin D is we can actually make it from the sun. But another unique thing is not only is it a vitamin, it's a hormone or steroid hormone. You can't say that about many of the other vitamins. It's also fat soluble, so that means your vitamins are fat soluble or water soluble, and that tells you about how to take them. Anything that's fat soluble means that you have to take it with some fat in order to absorb it properly, and that's super important because you could be absorbing virtually none of your vitamin D if you don't take it with some. About 2 teaspoons of fat is what you want, which is going to be in any typical balanced meal. But if you happen to be taking it away from a meal, what I do is I just put 2 teaspoons of any oil and take it at that time. You probably know that vitamin D regulates bone mineralization. That's what most people think when they think vitamin D. It helps with the deposition of calcium and phosphorus in the bones and makes the bones nice and strong. Now, of course, our bones need to be strong, but we also need some collagen so that they're flexible as well. So there's more to that in the bones. And because it's a hormone, not just a vitamin, it actually regulates hundreds of genes. And that's why there's this juggling act, turning on and off genes. You can see on the bottom here, there are different types of vitamin D. In a store, you'll find vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. Well, they look pretty similar for any chemistry aficionados out there. You can see there's a little double bond here and there's not there, but don't worry, you don't need to know that. When we go to the doctor and you get a vitamin D blood test, which you might consider, that type of vitamin D we're testing for is a little bit different too. And it is one of the outcomes of the vitamin D that we take. It's transformed into another form. Now, this is busy looking, so don't panic, but it's just to show that vitamin D juggles many different jobs. So the one thing that most people know, again, is calcium homeostasis in the body, helping with our bone mineralization, but it's by no means just that. So because it's a hormone, it up and down regulates many things, as you can see these arrows. For example, and many different markers in the body to do with inflammation. Vitamin D can affect inflammation. It can affect our antioxidant status to protect us against free radicals, can even have antibacterial effects ultimately, protect our endothelium, that's the lining of our arteries, and so on. So a lot of stuff. In terms of how it's made or how do we get into our body and what happens once it gets in, so depending on where we're starting from, we might be getting it from food or supplement, and we're going to swallow it. It's going to go into our digestive tract. Or we might be getting it from the sun, which I think is very fascinating. The sun on the skin helps to make vitamin D. So there's a kind of a pre-vitamin D here, which you'll notice, interestingly, the word cholesterol in there. So we actually need cholesterol to make the vitamin D from the sun. So we should never call cholesterol bad. It's sort of the context that's important. But we have this pre-vitamin D and we absorb it as well. And then vitamin D is transformed by the liver into a different form. That's the form that we test with the blood tests. And then it is again transformed by the kidneys to the hormone version. So that means it takes, the sunlight or the foods, and then, I guess a well-functioning liver and kidney in order to do that. And as I mentioned, of course, you can get it from foods. Now, it is of my opinion that for the most part, for most people, food is not a reliable way of getting optimal vitamin D intake. As an example here, you can see mushrooms you can get vitamin D from. Sometimes it can be fairly high. Think of the average supplement is about, if you get a vitamin D supplement all by itself, it's usually 1,000 IU, and this is 366 IU. Some mushrooms may just have traces of it. If you actually put your mushrooms out in the sun, just like us, they can make more vitamin D. So isn't that interesting? But it's not reliable in the sense that you don't know when you get your mushrooms. Sometimes there are fortified foods. Cod liver oil is a very decent form, but not everybody has, cod liver oil on a regular basis. So that's why many people do rely on supplements or sunshine. So speaking of sunshine, so it depends where we are in the world located, above or below the equator. This is going to dramatically affect how much vitamin D we can make. The further you are away from the equator, the harder it is to make vitamin D because the less intense that sunlight is. But there's another factor, and it's not really well visible down here, but it's showing different times that it might take to make vitamin D depending on your skin darkness, so the amount of melanin in your skin. For example, here with intense sunshine, somebody who's light skinned, like myself, might only need 10 minutes. Somebody with darker skin might need up to 45 minutes. The shadow rule is a great way to know when is the best time to make vitamin D. So you can see here, this is the angle of the sun. And the rule goes like this. If your shadow, here's the shadow, is longer than you are tall, you cannot make any vitamin D. Now, the lower the sun gets on the horizon, the longer your shadow will get. So the best time would be right at midday. So that's the shadow rule. Of course, in midday, then the UV index goes way up, so we have to be careful as well. So who might be at risk for vitamin D deficiency? That's important to know. There's many things that can limit the production of vitamin D in the skin. Of course, being indoors, and some people are indoors all year round for a lot. Sunblock. Now, I did hear one expert on a podcast recently say you actually can make vitamin D when you have sunblock, but that contradicts everything else I've heard. So I'd say for now, I'm not sure. Let's assume you cannot. It's possible in theory that people who take statin drugs for lowering cholesterol, because they lower cholesterol, and as you remember, I showed you we need cholesterol part to make that vitamin D. It's possible that this can put you at a disadvantage in terms of how much you can make. It's a theory. Winter months, we definitely make less. And in some cases, depending on how far you are from the equator, you're not making any during the winter. Higher altitudes, medical inpatients, just because they're, of course, out of the sun, and darker skin pigmentation. It doesn't mean you're not making any, of course, but you are making less. And there's different risk factors for vitamin D deficiency. Interestingly, so obesity is one of them. We do store vitamin D in our fat areas. So studies have shown that the larger you are, maybe you store more vitamin D, but you don't have access to it. As we get older, we are less effective at transforming that vitamin D from the sun. Genetic variation. So I showed you there's all these, take vitamin D and then the liver has to transform it and then the kidneys. And they are these kind of like Pac-Man enzymes or workers that help that with that transformation. But their effectiveness, the efficiency of those will vary from person to person depending on their genetics, meaning two people with the exact same vitamin D supplement or exposure are not necessarily making the same. Fat malabsorption, because it's fat soluble. So if you have celiac disease or anything affecting fat absorption, chronic liver, chronic kidney disease, because they are part of that transformation. Magnesium deficiency. You might have heard about magnesium, that it's deficient in a lot of people. I actually did my own test on an app called Chronometer, where you can enter in your diet. And even I eat very healthy and well-balanced diet. I can't get enough magnesium. So that's something. Genetic variances, as I mentioned, and any kind of bowel disease that might affect your absorption. I'd like to show you just this to point out the vitamin D in the aging population. Look at this. It's quite a very consistent drop in the amount of vitamin D that we can make when we expose our skin to sunlight every decade. And this is important because you might establish through blood test or something else what is the best amount of vitamin D for you, but we need to recheck that as the decades go on because we probably need to take more to maintain the same levels as we get older. So how much vitamin D do we need to take? I often get asked this. I like to base it on, and for my clients, I've always based it on blood tests. So if I go to Life Labs, which is in Toronto here in Ontario, they provide here a normal range of what vitamin D should be within. And in Canada, we use nanomoles per liter. We use these units. So if you look up vitamin D and you see other units, that can be confusing, but I'm going to focus on the Canadian values. And depending on which expert group that you would come across, there are going to be slight differences in what they consider to be in red here, in the danger zone, very low, and green, which would be optimal. But by and large, and this cutoff point here I just showed is in the Toronto labs, they say this is the lower end. But by and large, most experts and organizations sort of agree around this 50 nanomoles as kind of the cutoff. You don't want to be below that in your blood tests. I'm going to provide some arguments or expertise tonight as to why not only do we want to meet that baseline, but some studies suggest maybe would benefit from being higher than that. But just keep that 50, number 50 in your mind as we go through. That's going to help you understand some of the stuff to come. So do we have deficiencies in Canada, for example? Now, this data, unfortunately, is a little bit old because I couldn't find anything more recent, but it's important to know. So this is in 2003. There was a study that showed 34% of 2 to 12-year-old children in Edmonton, Alberta, had insufficient vitamin D levels. Now, Edmonton, yeah, quite, we're above the equator. And between October and March, if you live in Edmonton, Alberta, you make zero during those months. And there were 104 confirmed cases of rickets during these years. So I'm just going to take a little sip of the, not water, it's kombucha, by the way. A lovely drink. Now, I would hope and think that nowadays we're a bit more informed about vitamin D, so these numbers would be lower, but still important to consider. Here is another look in Canada. This was between 2009 and 2011, asking the question, like, what is the percentage of Canadians that are above or below that cutoff point, but based on age? And you can see here that it was, for whatever reason, between the ages of 20 and about 40, that we fared the worst, where 41% of people in that age group did not meet that cutoff or below the cutoff. But in every age group, there were some people that didn't. Again, hopefully we're doing better now. And I wanted to include this from the Canadian Pediatric Society. It's a position statement. Now, this is being recorded on YouTube, so you can go back and read through the details. They have a lot of interesting information and opinions, including vitamin D deficiency is common amongst adults and children in Canada. Now, this was last updated in 2021. Although when I checked just a week ago, I couldn't find the information or the link. So it might have been removed, but I thought I would still include it. And their opinion was also, there appears to be a discrepancy between our current practice and recommended intakes. So they were of the opinion that maybe some of the amounts that are indicated in our system right now are not optimal. And again, some more details you can look over in your own time. So when you go to the store, what kind of vitamin D can you find? There are actually two types, really. You can get vitamin D3. It will say on the bottle cholecalciferol, or vitamin D2, which is ergocalciferol. Vitamin D3 almost always comes from lanolin, which is sheep's wool. Whether people consider that, if you're vegan, whether you consider that okay or not, that's up to you, but that is where it comes from. There is another form that's plant-based that has some vitamin D3 in it. It's called lichen or lichen. Anyone is welcome out there to tell me how to pronounce it. I still to this day don't know. But actually, this plant contains D2 and D3 both. When you find products so out there, they always just mention the D3. So that does leave me wondering why and how much of the D3 is in there in comparison. So that's a little bit of a mystery. But then there's the other D2 products. So these would be appropriate for somebody who is strict vegan. There's a synthetic form. I don't think you'll find the synthetic form in a health food store. It's usually going to be extracted from mushrooms, which I mentioned is one source of vitamin D. So if you've ever looked this up and you're taking D2, you might have heard or come across information online saying D3 is better than D2. And there may be some truth to that. So why would that be? Well, vitamin D2 is metabolized, so sort of broken down and cleared out from the body faster than vitamin D3. So there certainly could be a bit of a disadvantage. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you get your vitamin D tested, because the vitamin D labs are really more optimally set up to test for vitamin D3, they may underestimate vitamin D2 levels. So you may have more than they show. There's nothing we can really do about that. But this is probably the most important thing, that at least one argument I found in a review said that the difference between vitamin D2 and D3 may only really be relevant when we're taking really high doses, which we call heroic doses. Like here's the hero, the superhero, as an example, 50,000 IU. Nobody will be taking these kind of amounts unless they are recommended by a doctor or a naturopath. But that's important to know. So how much vitamin D do we need here? Well, Health Canada will start on just on the right here with how much do we need with the recommended daily allowances. So it does go by age. For the most part, they recommend 600 IU. You can see it's a little bit higher here for 70 and over. That's because we don't convert it as well, as I mentioned, as we get older from the sun, and a little bit lower for younger kids. And they also show the upper limits here. So the upper limits mostly are going to be 4,000 IU. So that's the range. Now, I do want to point out, though, that you won't find 4,000 IU in the stores. The highest dose you will find in Canada anyway is 2,500. And I'll show you some different products right at the end, but 2,500 or 2,500 is the highest dose you will find. Anything above that is considered a prescription. So it would be recommended by a doctor to take higher amounts. I did want to mention here, not to scare anybody, vitamin D is generally safe, especially when taken within these ranges. But there is some information out there I've seen online by some health gurus and influencers that vitamin D is so safe you can take any amount and it can't harm you. And that's just not true. So vitamin D toxicity does exist. It can cause a buildup of calcium in your blood and deposits of calcium in your kidneys and otherwise. So definitely that's not the case. Now, the Mayo Clinic, which you've probably heard of, is quite a reliable resource of information. They say it may occur at blood levels of 375 nanomoles. So that's higher than the upper limit than the lab I go to allows for, but it can vary. So that's just something to keep in mind. So now if you are seeing somebody who's recommended high amounts, again, they should be followed up by some type of blood tests. And certainly when you're taking higher levels than average, they need to be balanced by some other nutrients like vitamin K and vitamin A, which are going to reduce the chance of that toxicity, but certainly not entirely. So we always have to be monitored. So we can get our vitamin D from foods, from sunlight, and we do have some body stores. Not a lot of information on this, but the reason I mentioned that is that even if you can't make any during the winter time, having enough sun exposure during the summertime may provide you enough for over the winter with stores, but the only way to know is to do a blood test. So in many cases, I find that it's helpful for people to take more in the winter and less in the summer, but it's going to vary again because it might be that you're indoors most of the time all year round or covered up in the summer anyway, and then it doesn't make a difference. Now, this is a picture that I took or a screenshot from a super interesting video on YouTube. If you ever have time, you can watch it. It was put on by the Vitamin D Society. And it asked the question, and this was actually, they are Canadian, so it asked the question, how much do we probably need for most people if we look at history and our ancestors? So what it showed here is there's a bar here, a line here, that is 50 nanomoles. That's that cutoff point that I mentioned that most expert bodies agree we should at least have that much vitamin D when we're tested for it. So when we look at old world primates of our ancestors, they on average, in this red area is where 50% of people would have been. So on average, 50% of our old world primates would have had blood levels of over 100. So well above, double that baseline. And the lines above and below show some of the outliers, because this is just 50% of people, but everybody would have been above that cutoff point. Now, here was a study looking at if you take people who are being exposed 2 to 3 times a week, the whole front and back of their body to a lot of sunlight. So they looked at people who go to the tanning beds, which I definitely don't recommend. And I think they also included lifeguards in that. They get a lot of sun. So for those people, they would be, on average, half of them, again, well above in the 80s, and the outliers were still well above. Now, if you look at people in Toronto in the dead of the winter, we have a problem here because 50% of them were below that cutoff of 50. Some outliers were above, and others were even lower than that. If we take those same people and we supplement them with 1,000 IU, which is readily available as a supplement, it's pretty good. Half of them are above the 50 cutoff. Some are even higher, but we still got a few that are not. So that means 1,000 IU is sufficient for most people to get above that, but not everybody. How do you know if you do? You get a blood test. If we, on the other hand, gave them 4,000 IU, then everybody was in a optimal range. So their overall conclusion was, well, probably for most people, about 4,000 IU is going to put them in a pretty good position. And the same group of experts that were responsible for that video. So they call themselves the Vitamin Society. It's again a grassroots scientist organization that advocates for the prevention of diseases that relate to low vitamin D. It's 48 scientific advisors. First, so they showed this information, it's to show the link between high blood levels of vitamin D, so in a quite optimal range above that 50. If you have 125 nanomoles per liter in vitamin D in the blood, you'll have a reduction of disease incidence for all these different diseases of, so 100% of rickets, nobody will get rickets, and 80% reduction of diabetes, and 80% of related cardiovascular disease risk, and so on. Heart attacks. So that looks really, really great. But we do have to remember that these are correlations, not necessarily causation. We need to prove, is that cause and effect, or are they just linked together? And to understand, well, so what's the difference? I wanted to make this interesting point. So what is the difference between correlation and causation? How do we know? So higher disease activity may simply be associated with less time spent outdoors. So in other words, it's possible if we look at something like, okay, so people who have a higher incidence of diabetes and also seem to have lower vitamin D, maybe that's not because they're not getting enough vitamin D, it's because they're not spending as much time outdoors being active. They're not socializing out much, which maybe we do in the outdoors. They're not getting as much, relaxation and that sort of thing. So the vitamin D might just be a proxy for time spent outdoors and all the advantages of that. So we don't know, and we still need to then look at studies that show, is there an actual link, a causative link between lower vitamin D levels and the higher incidence of all these diseases? So I'm going to have us look at some of those. So what is the evidence for using vitamin D? This is one really important one that's close to my heart, because I have, I've parents that have fallen in their older age, and many friends who have had their elderly parents falling, quite common and an issue. So over 60-year-olds who consume 8 200 IU of vitamin D2 or D3 daily have a significant reduction in the risk of falling. And this was reported by the European Food Safety Authority. The same panel agreed that vitamin D supplementation, when combined with calcium, could benefit body sway, muscle function, and strength, or both, together with a significant reduction in the risk of falling. So vitamin D is not only important for our bone strength, but actually also affects, because it's a hormone, again, affects many things, but affects our muscles and their function. So you need to have your muscles and your balance, everything contributes to reducing the risk of fall. What about when it comes to the flu or influenza? So here is a study. They used 1,200 IU of vitamin D or placebo in Japanese school children. So that's quite a higher dose, at least than is typically recommended, or say by Health Canada, for this age group. But they did use that in the wintertime. And what they found was the study group, those children who took the vitamin D, these levels, had a 58% relative risk in influenza or flu in comparison to the placebo. So that was helpful. And a subgroup of those kids that had a history of asthma experienced a 17% relative risk reduction in the flu. What about other more general look at our immunity? So there are thousands of studies on vitamin D, which I couldn't look at all of them, but I did look at this summary because it's so relevant for COVID. Now these are all different studies. This is a randomized or a meta-analysis. So they look at a whole bunch of studies together and try to see what kind of conclusions can we draw from that. These are short studies where they give various doses of vitamin D to people that have been admitted to hospital with COVID. And then they look at the outcomes in terms of who landed up in the ICU, meaning it advanced to a very serious state, and who didn't. Now, as I mentioned, the doses vary, and some of these are very high, like 10,000 IU a day or 200,000 IU. And there are cases where doctors will give very high doses of vitamin D for short periods of time, either daily or sometimes once a week or monthly. It's one of those vitamins, unlike others, that can be used more intermittently at high doses versus daily. But the overall conclusion here in the discussion, it said the result of the meta-analysis suggested a definitive association between the protective role of vitamin D and ICU hospitalization. So there was less ICU hospitalization in those who were getting those doses of vitamin D. And here, another study also related to COVID. So they compiled information data from 7 different hospitals. And the green line here is sort of the cumulative effect showing of those studies. And what they showed, so this was at a time when the vaccines were not yet available. And what they found was patients with sufficiently high vitamin D serum levels preceding the infection, so before they had the infection, were highly unlikely to suffer from a fatal outcome. The lower threshold for healthy vitamin D levels, in their opinion, based on the study, should lie at approximately 125 nanomoles. That's here. So those who had their blood levels at 125 nanomoles before they were admitted to hospital had 0 incidence of death. And for that reason, they decided that this may be sort of the cutoff of the optimal levels for those people under those situations. So again, 50 nanomoles per liter is the general cutoff of the lowest you want to be. But this study is suggesting, or maybe being at higher levels could be an advantage, because those the cutoff levels, what for the most part, what Health Canada and other bodies are focusing on when they have that cutoff is how much do we need so that we don't have rickets, our bones aren't falling apart. But vitamin D doesn't only protect the bones. So we're looking at, well, other circumstances which higher levels might be of benefit. We're kind of building a case here bit by bit. What about vitamin D in cardiovascular disease being, sort of number 1 killer, though it has been reduced over the years due to kind of more knowledge. in theory, if we look at vitamin D, you can see that it's known to have many different effects in the body that should be protective for cardiovascular disease. It results in relaxing our vessels more. So if your vessels are more relaxed, then your blood pressure can be lower. Less oxidative stress or damage to the arteries. May help with repair of the lining of the arteries. So all of these things suggest that vitamin D should be playing a role in cardiovascular disease. When we look at the study, so this I tried to find the most updated reviews on vitamin D. Unfortunately, in this particular review, they said there's no strong evidence for benefit of vitamin D effect on cardiovascular disease risk in the general population or in high risk groups. So I was like, okay. This particular review looked at 3 different randomized controlled trials. Those are in the red. And the evidence was the same, not looking good. We didn't really see any improvement when it comes to a heart attack or stroke or mortality with vitamin D. But an important note that they said is that in all 3 of these randomized controls, the average vitamin D levels were above that 50 nanomole per liter cutoff. And I noticed this kind of pattern. So that makes you think, well, what if they had included people in the study only who were below the cutoff that we consider to be? So if you take people in a study on vitamin D who are already in the normal range, maybe you're not going to really see any significant results. But what if you use people who weren't? Unfortunately, they didn't. So that's one of the flaws in the study and in those studies. Have a look at this. So this is looking at the effect of the correlation of vitamin D deficiency on arterial stiffness. So the stiffness of your arteries is an important factor for cardiovascular disease. We want them to be flexible so that they can expand, so they don't get clogged. Vitamin D supplementation, in this case, significantly improved arterial stiffness in several subgroups by correcting for a vitamin D deficiency. So what they showed in the study, that's important. If you actually take people who have low vitamin D levels, who are not meeting that basic amount, then you do notice an improvement in one important aspect for cardiovascular disease, which is the flexibility of the arteries. And the study was done for 4 months at a daily dose of 2000 IU for those people who were below the optimal. So they found that, again, the arteries became more flexible. Does that matter? What does arterial stiffness do in terms of our long-term risk of health outcomes? Well, this Framingham study, which was a very big observational study of 7,283 participants, average age of 50, and it showed that there is a link between the long-term prognosis for stroke, death, diabetes, dementia, or even chronic kidney disease in those who have suboptimal arterial stiffness. So this tells me, my conclusion from all of this is that vitamin D definitely has benefits for cardiovascular disease for those who are not in the optimal range. So we got to test our vitamin D levels and make sure that we're above that 50 for cardiovascular disease, but it might not have a huge impact otherwise for those who are already kind of in that healthy range. Now, here's a study where they were a bit smarter about it. It's the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, 18,000 or more men aged 40 to 73. They were free of diagnosis of cardiovascular disease at the time the blood was collected. But an important aspect is they were all below that 50. They had less than 37.5 nanomoles, and they had an increased risk of 2.42 times for getting a heart attack compared to those who had levels that were above. So again, this says, yes, vitamin D is important to prevent heart attacks in those who are below that 50 mark. What about diabetes? So here's a study looking at pre-diabetes, people that are at risk. They're kind of on the borderline. So the study was done in adults with pre-diabetes, and it showed that vitamin D was effective in decreasing the risk for actually developing diabetes. Vitamin D3 reduced diabetes risk by 76%. That's huge in participants who maintained a higher average serum D level of at least 125 nanomoles during the follow-up period. So what this is showing is that there was a definite advantage in reducing the risk of developing vitamin D in those who had not only reached that 50, that cutoff, but had even higher levels, optimal levels. So we're seeing that as a pattern too. Sometimes it seems there might be a benefit of not only getting to that 50, but being higher. What about mental health? So vitamin D does play a role in our mental health. We know, I won't go into too many details, but vitamin D can affect different chemicals in our brain that ultimately can affect our mood or a sense of well-being. Vitamin D affects dopamine in the brain. If you're not familiar with dopamine, it's often referred to as the molecule of more, but it's a chemical in our brain that's so important for motivation, for pursuing things, for a sense of pleasure. And some of the very newer generation drugs for depression actually focus on dopamine. And serotonin, you might be more familiar with. That's kind of more of an older generation drugs focus on serotonin as a chemical in our brain that also affects our mood. Now, mood is a complex thing. So we have here a reason to believe that vitamin D might have a role in our mental health based on the fact that it's important for the production of those two chemicals. But when we test it out, what do we see? So we're looking at a very recent meta-analysis looking at a whole bunch of different randomized controlled trials that included in total about 4,500 participants, a range of ages here. To take a sip of water again. 8 weeks was considered the minimum amount of cutoff to be included in the study of supplementation. What they found looking at all of these is that for those who seem to have an effect on their mood, a positive effect, who were supplementing with vitamin D, 2,800 IU seemed to be the minimum threshold dose in order to get a benefit. So it's a little bit higher again than, so there's 2,500, as I said, is the highest amount that you'll find in a supplement in Canada in a health food store. And another just interesting tidbit is those most likely to benefit with females with low vitamin D levels that were below that cutoff. Okay. Tickle my throat here, so I'm gonna move my microphone. Okay. What about pain? Now, I did see various different reviews on pain. It's a very hard thing to study, and the problem is that there's so many different kinds of pains and variations. But I wanted to mention fibromyalgia because that's when kind of I think the one study where the evidence was a little bit more obvious and direct. So in people who are vitamin D deficient, supplementation appears to alleviate the symptoms of fibromyalgia. If you're not familiar with fibromyalgia, it's kind of a chronic condition. It can be very difficult for people. It's a syndrome. There's chronic pain involved for sure, but many other things. And there are 3 clinical trials of good quality that show consistent evidence of a moderate improvement in pain for fibromyalgia for those who are deficient to begin with. Doses of 50,000 IU weekly for 3 months in vitamin D deficient people in one study. The doses that proved to be helpful were either sort of a high dose weekly for 3 months or a low daily dose adjusted to the goal of blood level. So there's different ways of approaching it, but fibromyalgia definitely is another area we consider vitamin D. And so those are some of the studies. There's certain studies in some other areas that I could have gone through, but just for in the interests of time, I thought those ones are most important and applicable to most people. So if we look at, oh my God, there's so many vitamin D supplements, I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea what's out there and what's the difference. For the most part, I can say, it's just a matter of personal preference, but there are some differences to consider. So just as an example of what we have in the Now brand, we've got so many. Um, well, there's vitamin D2 here. So that's going to be suitable for vegetarians or vegans. And that's bottom line. I wouldn't worry too much about the fact of, is it or is not as good as vitamin D3, because if it isn't, you simply can rely on a blood test to tell you whether you need to take more or less, regardless of the form you're taking. Then we have some lower dose, 400 IU. I don't find that that's going to be sufficient for most people, but it may be for somebody. There are outliers. The 1000 IU is more typical. Now this often comes in a soft gel, so it's going to come in a little bit of oil, the base of oil in the soft gel, but it's not 2 teaspoons of oil. You still need to take it with food, but it's good to have it in a bit of oil in the first place. That certainly helps with the absorption. There are, in this case, chewables for some people who don't like to swallow pills. And this one is naturally sweetened with xylitol and sorbitol. Those are safe for the teeth. There's the liquid form. So in this case, this is the Now Kids vitamin. It's really great because it has no flavoring, so it can kind of just go into anything or add it into food. This is appropriate for ages 0 onwards, really. So vitamin D is one of those very few vitamins that is so safe that you can give it to a newborn. This is the adult extra strength vitamin D. So the kids one is only 100 IU per drop, which means you can dose it according to as you need, as it's suggested, or as your doctor might suggest. And the 1000 is a bit higher. Yes, adults can take the kids one, but it's probably more economical to take the adult one if you want a liquid. Then you have the 2500 IU. So this is the highest dose you can get. It's a high potency. It does have a different claim on it than any other ones. It says for those who are at risk of osteoporosis. The other ones won't say that. And, that makes sense because it's a higher dose. And you have one here with vitamin D that's combined with vitamin K2. Many people like to take vitamin K along with their vitamin D. Whether you need to do that or not depends person to person. You can get vitamin K2 from your diet, if you're eating yogurt or other animal foods. I do take vitamin K and I take it separately. When you're taking quite high doses of vitamin D, that's when you really need to worry about taking a vitamin K. If someone's taking, for short term, because their levels are very low, they're taking 10,000 a day or, high amounts of vitamin D, you definitely want to consider combining it with vitamin K. And just by way of a summary of everything that I've said now tonight, just to bring it all back. So vitamin D benefits may include bone and teeth matrix support for sure. Reduce risk of cardiovascular disease. I think I showed that especially in those who have low levels to begin with. Metabolic support. We saw those people with pre-diabetes who benefited from the reduced risk of developing diabetes, especially when they were in the kind of higher range of vitamin D of about 125. Immune support. So I showed some studies specifically with regard to the flu for kids or COVID. Vitamin D supplementation doses are best based on blood testing. So if anyone asks me how much vitamin D they should take, my answer is always going to be get a blood test and decide from there with your doctor. That's the best way. Now, if you have osteopenia, they don't call it that anymore, or osteoporosis, it would be covered in Ontario, where I am, by OHIP. You won't have to pay for it. I'm not sure what it's like out in BC. But the prices have come down for vitamin D in our area. It's maybe about $40 to test. So it's well worth it to do for a while, especially if you haven't done it before, maybe to test it in the summer and the winter time, just to see if there's a difference. And, at some point you kind of have an idea of how much you need and don't have to keep testing it. But again, as you age and the decades go by, I think it's a good idea to keep testing. Vitamin D2 and D3 are likely equally beneficial at very low doses, but more studies are needed for sure to figure that out. And if you're doing those heroic doses, there could be a difference. Target blood test should be a minimum of 50 nanomoles per liter by most global standards, but maybe as high as 100 or 150 for reduced risk of some diseases. But more studies are needed to confirm the absolute perfect range or amount. Nobody agrees on that at all. Any doses above 2,500 in Canada are prescription, so should be done under advisement. And the upper safe limit for D, according to Health Canada, is 4,000 IU. So that sort of pulls everything together. I hope that that helps you. So if you go back and watch the video, you can even just watch this last bit on the slide and just to remind you of everything. And that brings me to the end. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I hope you learned something new that you find useful tonight about vitamin D.
Thank you so much. That was actually very interesting. I didn't know about the leaving the mushrooms out in the sun, so it's a new little
Yes.
hack for me. I will be using, I think.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I don't see any currently.
Good. Maybe that means like I was so thorough that I left no questions.
That seems like it. Let's see. Just reload the page. Oh, here we go. Yes, so there's one question asking if that they take their vitamin D with their egg in the morning. Is that enough fat?
And I can't say for sure
Yeah.
off the top of my head how much fat is in an egg. But eggs are fatty. They certainly have some amount of, maybe if it's just one egg, no. If it's a couple eggs and it's cooked in some kind of oil, yeah, I wouldn't stress too much about it. I don't want to imply that people have to be measuring the amount of oil in every meal. But if you're eating a decent normal size meal that will give you enough calories, like say you're at an average meal, say 500-600 calories. So like a couple of eggs cooked in a bit of oil, maybe there's some potatoes with it or something, is probably going to be fine. Yeah. So don't stress too much. It's really more those people who are consistently taking their vitamin D in between their meals on an empty stomach that are just going to absorb none of it and that really need to worry.
There was another question asking more about like sunlight and how long you should be exposed to sunlight and how much skin. I'm not sure if you're able to speak to that.
I mean, not in too much detail because there's so many variables, because it's going to depend on your skin color. It's going to depend on where you're living versus on the equator. It's going to depend on how many hours you are out, how much of your body is exposed. So it's going to depend also on your ability for your skin to, as you get older, or it could be even like skin types, health of the skin to convert it. So there were those averages I showed on the slide that people can use as just to get you a general idea. But whatever you're doing, and you want to try to get out into the sun as much as you can without burning yourself in the times of year where you can, you still ultimately need to do a blood test and see based on your lifestyle and how much time you're able to spend outside, which we should anyway to get fresh air, to exercise, and see, between that and your diet, are you at the optimal amounts? Yeah, but I mean, people can Google online, but it's still going to be a matter of so many variables. So just try to get out, and you don't have to be, of course, like in a tanning salon or like a lifeguard. It can just be your arms and your legs and your face. But yeah, all of those variables together is just to give a general idea.
And there's one open-ended question. It's asking if you could speak more about vitamin D and osteoporosis.
Um, well, obviously it's saying very important. So if we don't have enough vitamin D, certainly we're at high risk for osteoporosis, or for someone who's younger for rickets. When you're older, it's called osteomalacia, and your bones can, if you the vitamin D basically, along with vitamin K, and it's not just vitamin D. So our bones are made up of or require many minerals that play a role. Magnesium, as I mentioned, boron. Sometimes you can get if you look at a bone complex in a health food store, it has many minerals. So there's different roles of the different minerals. And those are all important for our bone health, as is collagen. Collagen is also because vitamin D and with vitamin K can help us absorb enough calcium. And then we need the calcium to get to the bones. Vitamin K can help with that as kind of like a little directing the calcium to the bones rather than it depositing elsewhere. We don't want the calcium to be in our arteries or elsewhere. So the vitamin D is going to play an important role to get calcium into the bones so the bones are strong. But if our bones are really, really strong, they can still, if you think about something really, really strong and stiff, and then you have a force applied to it, it might be strong, but it might break because it's so brittle. So you need collagen that allows for that flexibility for the bones to bend under pressure. So it's certainly a number of things. And then you also need, in order for the bones to kind of shift the collagen and how it's positioned so that it's optimal, you need to stress those bones to build. So it's kind of like with muscles. You can't just take protein to have healthy muscles. You also need to work the muscles. Same with the bones. You need to stress the bones, which means moving the muscles. And I'll just give a quick bit of an example to this person who's asking overall about osteoporosis. I myself, actually, because it runs in my family, I had osteoporosis around the time of menopause and osteopenia before that. So, despite my good lifestyle and everything, I did find out that my vitamin D levels were below normal, even though I was taking, for many years, probably 1,000 IU, sometimes more. I'm one of those people who, for whatever reason, maybe genetics, I'm not getting enough vitamin D. I require personally about 4,000 or 5,000 IU a day. So what I did was I took my vitamin D. I also took vitamin K. I also did weight-bearing exercises. If you want to know specifically, one called the deadlift, where you just pick up a heavy weight off the ground. That's particularly important when you have osteoporosis. You want to put stress on the spine from above to below. So it could be like a heavy backpack with weights in it, or picking up something very heavy. I did that as well. I took some other minerals, ate a healthy diet. I got my calcium from yogurt and such. And within a year, my bones improved. I went from osteoporosis to osteopenia, even in menopause. And medical professionals will typically tell you, in fact, my own doctor told me that you cannot improve your bone density in menopause. The best you can do is just to reduce the reduction in your bone by doing these things. But I proved them otherwise. Someone else in my family did either. So you certainly can, if you put all these things into practice, your proper, activity and giving the nutrients that your bone needs, even improve your bone density. And again, vitamin D is certainly a part of that. So I based my vitamin D on my blood tests.
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming through. So I think we will end it here. Thank you so much for the presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And
Thank you to Choices Markets.
yeah, and thank you everyone for tuning in.